Hey, what's going on there, guys? Nick here from Absolute MTG, and welcome to a new episode of a new installment that we're trying out here on the channel called The Essentials. So, with Battle for Zendikar coming out, this is my list of the essentials and the things that I'm looking for when I'm opening up packs and booster boxes and fat packs, what have you. This set is really awesome, and it has a lot of awesome stuff. A lot of people are really excited about it, but here is my list of things in each color and each card type that we're going to be looking through, and the things that catch my eye and should probably catch your eye as well. So first and foremost, I think one of the big things that's on everybody's radar right now is the new cycle of lands. So we have these lands that are called Tango lands. So they are in sorts kind of like slow lands as opposed to Scars of Mirrodin, where we had quick lands that were based off of how many lands you had in play and having few of them. So we have Sunken Hollow, Canopy Vista, Prairie Stream, Smoldering Marsh, and Cinder Glade. And for you guys that play Standard, we're losing our Scry lands, so this is going to be our replacement. They are dual subtypes, so you're going to be able to use your fetch lands and actually fetch for them, but they are going to enter the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. We are also receiving some new man lands within the set as well. However, it's not something that I'm as excited about, and I don't think it's something that's really reaching the essentials list as far as my opinion is concerned. Will I think they'll see actual play? Yeah, more than likely. However, it's not something that I'm overly impressed with. Up next, we have our multicolored cards and our colorless card from the set that I am looking forward to. So first, we have Sire of Stagnation. So this card is definitely reminiscent to me of Consecrated Sphinx. It's not quite the same, however, it's a little bit similar, but I really love this card. It's a 5/7 for 6. It has the Void, so it has no color, which plays into a lot of different themes within the set, and a lot of different strategies that could potentially arise, and it kind of has reverse landfall, so whenever lands enter your opponent's battlefield, they are going to exile the top 2 cards of their library, and you get to draw 2 cards. Is it completely invulnerable to removal, and will it just always stick on the field? No, probably not, but if you're able to catch your opponent off guard, they can't remove it, they can't get rid of it, then you can kind of idly sit by and make your opponent make some tough decisions. If they actually have to hit land drops, then you are just accelerating yourself forward. One thing that Wizards of the Coast has done very well recently has been introducing a whole lot of tribal stuff and then giving it some support and making people actually enjoy it. And March from the Tomb is exactly what allies are going to have to make people actually enjoy the archetype and try to mess around with fun decks that are going to recur things from the graveyard. So March is a 5 mana cost card, sorcery speed, and it allows you to return any number of target ally creatures with total converted mana cost 8 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So no, that's not to the top of your library or back to your hand so you can recast them. Just puts them on the battlefield. So it allows you to get any enter the battlefield abilities off of them or any interactions that they have whenever another ally enters the battlefield, whether it's another ally or itself entering, and it just opens the doors for a lot of different possibilities for cool and interesting interactions that you could cause with building a tribal deck. And while we're on the topic of tribal decks, it seems that Eldrazi aggro, if not right now, is going to be a thing in the very near future, especially if they decide to give more support for this type of an archetype within the next set that's going to be coming out for the block. So Forerunner of Slaughter seems to be just that ideal card that these types of aggressive Eldrazi Devoid decks are actually going to want. So it's a 3/2 for 2 mana, it has the Void, so it's colorless. And for 1 mana, you can give target colorless creature haste until the end of the turn. So it assures you that anything you're throwing out onto the board for 1 mana more, you can just make it have haste and make it much more threatening. And same thing goes for our Duskstalker, which seems to be another very great pair to be able to go along with cards like Forerunner of Slaughter. So it's a 5/3 for 4, so already you're getting a little bit more power out of it than what you would actually assume out of a 4-drop. And it has the Void as well. It has haste on its own, so you don't have to worry about spending extra mana on it. But at the beginning of each end step, if you control no other colorless creatures, return it back to its owner's hand, which probably shouldn't be a problem for you, considering if you're playing this card, chances are you're going to be playing it in a more aggressive, Devoid Eldrazi aggro deck. Our next card here is Grove Rumbler, and while it doesn't seem that landfall has quite as much support as the Eldrazi sub-theme or even the ally sub-theme within the set has. Landfall still actually has the potential of being really, really outstanding. So this creature has trample and it's a 3/3 for 4, which is nothing that's actually that bad. But with landfall, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, it's going to get +2/+2 until the end of the turn. So maybe you have some fetch lands that you're able to crack. So you play a fetch land for the turn, gets +2/+2. You crack the fetch land and then search for another land to put onto the battlefield, and it gets another additional +2/+2 for the turn, allowing you to swing in with a 7/7 that also has trample. And on turn 4, swinging on turn 5 with that is actually pretty good. And as for our colorless cards within this set, the only lonely one that made my list here is Aligned Hedron Network. And this card, to me, just seems really sweet because at heart, I'm just a control player. So it's an artifact for 4, and whenever it enters the battlefield, exile all creatures with power 5 or greater until the Allied Hedron Network leaves the battlefield. So you can allow your opponent to resolve a few threats that you don't counter, leave some creatures out onto the battlefield that have 5 power, and let your opponent overcommit onto the board, and then you play the Allied Hedron Network and get rid of them. Even if you get one creature, it still seems fine, but if you're able to swoop a whole bunch of your opponent's creatures that they cheat out in the play with something like See the Unwritten, then you're smooth sailing. You're able to deal with what your opponent's playing, and then you can try to actually get there and win the game. Our white cards that we have here on the Essentials list are also probably things you don't want to overlook. First and foremost, we have Gideon, Ally of Zendikar. So this guy, as much as I want this to be Gideon Jura, is a little bit close. So he's a 4 loyalty, 4 cost planeswalker. So right off the bat, 4 loyalty is pretty nice. It doesn't die to burn spells as easily. For +1, he is going to become a 5/5 human soldier ally with Indestructible. That's still a planeswalker. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to him this turn. With a 0 ability, he is going to make 2/2 white knight ally creatures that are going to enter the battlefield, so it could potentially trigger off any ally triggers that you have otherwise. And with his -4 ultimate, you get an emblem where creatures you control get +1/+1. So already I can see that people are going to try and play some aggressive white decks, maybe even just mono white again, and are going to just jam this guy because at worst you can still get an Anthem out of it, if not just produce some 2/2s every single turn. Or he himself can just become a 5/5 that is indestructible that can just keep on swinging in at your opponent. Overall, I think this card is just super well-rounded and is exactly what I want out of a Planeswalker that I would play in Constructed. Next, we have Stasis Snare. So it's pretty interesting that we got Journey into Nowhere at a instant speed. So for a 3-cost, 1 and double white enchantment that also has flash, whenever Stasis Snare enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. So I was actually hoping for a Journey into Nowhere reprint, and I guess I kind of got it, but Stasis Snare is definitely something that I would expect to see in Constructed play, especially in Standard, not so much the other Eternal formats. But Stasis Snare being just an enchantment that you can flash in and catch your opponent off guard is definitely something that control decks love to do, not giving your opponent very much information and being able to respond to their cards, while also, well, actually being able to respond to their cards and do stuff. One thing that you guys will find in this review and any set review that I ever do is that I really have a soft spot for cards that could fit themselves into a control shell, and Gideon's Reproach is one of those cards that really just catches my eye for that. So instant speed, 2-cost spell, instantly just something that I would really gravitate towards when building a constructed deck, but also something that I would gravitate towards when I'm actually drafting as well. So instant speed, 2-cost, deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. Now, for 2 mana, that's insane, especially if you're trying to deal with your opponent's threats early on, and just being able to have some easy 1-for-1 removal that you can trade with your opponent's creature, and just for 2 mana, makes it so that actually being able to mitigate the damage that your opponent is actually putting out, and the threats that they're putting out on the battlefield is a pretty easy chore for you. And our last card here for our white cards for the Essentials list is Emiria Shepherd. So It's a 4/4 for 7 mana, which may seem like a whole lot, but it has flying and landfall. Now, the landfall is what actually makes this card interesting. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you can return a target non-land permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. If that land was a plains, you can return that non-land permanent to the battlefield instead. Now, I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of abusive manipulation that you can do within Standard, and being able to just kind of jam things and reanimate them super easy. However, this actually does catch my eye as a super interesting card for something that maybe EDH players could build around and could find some combos to actually have work out. Now, I'm not saying that this card couldn't be just a breakout hit and somebody figures something out and Emiria Shepherd is just the instant Angel of Serenity that we needed to just reanimate stuff and recur things and be able to just play out of our graveyard. However, I think overall the card just actually has a whole lot of potential, and if at worst, it might be one of those EDH cards that everybody really enjoys and will actually just flock to, and might make the foils a little bit more sought after. And now we've made our way to the blue cards of the set, so my personal favorite. And even though we don't have a laundry list of rares and mythics here, you really just get to see how well blue does with just commons and uncommons here. So first we have Horribly Awry. Now, I'll admit, whenever I looked at this card, I actually assumed it said counter target spell with converted mana cost 4 or less. If it's countered that way, exile it instead. And I just flipped out about it because that's actually just insane. The fact that we get a spell that's just going to counter anything 4 CMC or less and also counters it and is also a colorless spell as well, technically, is just really insanely sweet. And for 2 mana, like, that's just perfect. In my eyes, that's just exactly what I want for that type of a spell at instant speed. Well, I mean, obviously we can't have it at sorcery speed, though. But looking back at it and seeing that it's only creature spells, well, I mean, obviously makes it worse. But at the same time, it doesn't make it unplayable, because even after the rotation happens here, and for Standard, when we're looking at the creatures that are actually playable, there are a lot of them that are 4 CMC or less, and I would be really, really surprised if Horribly Awry saw absolutely no play. It's also pretty interesting that the next 2 cards that we are going to be talking about here are actually reprints. So we have a reprint of Dispel with some insanely sweet new art featuring Jace on it. But instant speed, 1 blue, counter target instant spell. It's great to have it back, and it's great to be able to interact with what our opponent might be doing, whether it's counter spells, removal, burn, whatever it may be, Abzan charms to try to get rid of our creatures. Dispel is just going to be one of those cards that'll make its way into sideboards, and it'll allow you to just catch your opponent off guard and make them actually wonder, well, do you have Dispel mana open, and are you just actually bluffing it all the time? I love Dispel being around, and it's just one of those great cards I love having in the sideboard. And as far as main boards are concerned, I love that Anticipate got another reprint. So Anticipate is back with some new art as well. It hasn't been long since we just recently saw it, but Wizards is making sure that we have Anticipate for a while, and we get to interact with looking at the top X amount of cards on our library and choosing one and getting rid of the others to the bottom of our library. So Anticipate, well, it's here to stay, I guess. We also have Spell Shrivel, which is another counter spell for us, and this one's actually pretty interesting because it reminds me a whole lot of Mana Leak. However, instead of 2 mana, this spell costs 3, and is also colorless, but instead of countering unless your opponent pays 3, this one counters unless they pay 4, and also if the spell is countered that way, it exiles it instead. And last but not least, we do have our pretty generic, but at the same time also not very generic counterspell to the set as well, Scatter to the Winds. So 3 mana instant speed, counter target spell, but it also has Awaken 3 for 6 mana. So it allows control decks to be able to do a little bit extra with their mana, where normally with counter spells, you're pretty much just trying to deprive your opponent of what they're doing, and you just kind of call it a day there, and then you take your own respective turn, you play your threats, and then you just smash face. Well, that's not really the case with Scattered to the Winds. With this, you're allowed to counter a spell and also produce a threat as well, which thus far in a counterspell we have not seen. But much like the blue cards within the set, I love being able to talk about the black cards within the set, taking a look at the removal that is offered to us, as well as the powerhouse creeps that are also going to make their way into the set as well. So first we have Wasteland Strangler, which again is adding towards the whole Eldrazi, Devoid, low CMC guys that you could potentially play aggressively. So 3-2 for 3, it has the Void. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you can put a card an opponent owns in exile into that player's graveyard, and if you do, target creature gets -3/-3 until the end of the turn. So this card reminds me a whole lot of Skin Render, but at the same time, it's a little bit cheaper to actually cast. However, it requires a little bit more synergy and a little bit more interaction and timing than Skin Render does. But at the same time, I would be really surprised if this card sees like absolutely no play whatsoever, and I think it's one of those cards that structurally is actually pretty sound and could definitely make its way into some sweet synergies. We also have Ruinous Path that is going to be replacing Hero's Downfall, so while it's not instant speed, it still is pretty much going to do the exact same thing that we want it to do. Destroy a creature or planeswalker for 3 mana, and with the Awaken 4, we can also get some additional value out of it. We also have Ob Nixilis Reignited, so he is a 5 loyalty, 5 cost planeswalker, where with his +1 we can draw a card and lose 1 life, allowing us to accelerate our draws. With the -3 we can destroy target creature, and with the -8, target opponent gets an emblem with whenever a player draws a card, you lose 2 life. So Ob Nixilis reminds me a whole lot of Vraska, while also being much different than Vraska as well. I guess it's probably the whole fact of it being a 5 mana planeswalker with 5 loyalty that for -3 gets to destroy a creature, I guess, but at the same time Vraska allowed you to destroy a non-land permanent. But the Ob Nixilis actually seems like it's going to be one of those cards that's just pretty playable in control and mid-range and basically just slow decks. It allows you to just kind of win in the attrition war. It allows you to have a little bit of removal while also not immediately killing itself when you go to use the -3 on the first turn. And ultimately, the ultimate that it has on it is actually not all that bad. We also have a pseudo reprint of Blood Artist in Zulaport Cutthroat. So it's a 1/1 for 2 mana, and whenever it or another creature that you control dies, as opposed to Blood Artist where it was whenever a creature died, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So it's a one-sided Blood Artist for only your creatures interacting with them dying, but at the same time, it's each opponent as opposed to target opponent. So if you're building this card for something like EDH and multiplayer formats, it could be strictly better for you than Blood Artist just because you can hit all of your opponents and try to kill everybody faster. We also have Smothering Aberration, which is another Eldrazi creature that is a 4/3 for 4, 2 in double black, with the Void and Flying. And at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature, and whenever you sacrifice a creature, draw a card. So this card is going to reward you for finding ways to ultimately reuse the creatures that you have and get any leave the battlefield abilities or whenever this creature dies abilities to actually trigger off. And it also allows you to also draw some cards while providing a 4-power body that also has flying, can get over your opponent's stuff, and can deal some damage pretty quick. And last but far from least, we have Drana, Liberator of Malakir, being a 2/3 for 3 creature that is legendary with Flying First Strike, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature you control. One thing to remember about this card is that with its First Strike, it's going to deal its damage sooner than your creatures that don't have First Strike, so you'll have that trigger go onto the stack, and when it resolves, it'll resolve before your non-First Strike attacking creatures have actually dealt damage, so there is going to be a modifier which can allow you to yet deal more damage. So kind of confusing, but don't worry, it just makes your dudes bigger before they actually deal damage if they don't have First Strike. Plain and simple, basically. We only have 4 red cards on our list here, but they are definitely nothing that you want to overlook. The first one is Crumble to Dust. So this card is our pseudo reprint of Sowing Salt. So we have a sorcery speed card for 4, 3 and 1 red, with the Void, so it has no color. So we get to exile target non-basic land and search its controller's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards with the same name as that land and exile them. That player shuffles his or her library. So this could play into any potential strategies that you have with putting cards into your opponent's exile and then being able to manipulate things with them. But at the same time, it provides to be some land destruction that could also try to warp the way that your opponent's actually playing the game and potentially throw them off of any specific mana fixing or certain configurations of mana that they would actually try to go for that you may or may not already know about. Our next card is Radiant Flames, and it's probably as close to a replacement to Anger of Gods as we're going to get here in a sorcery speed card for 3. With Converge, it's going to deal X damage to each creature, where X is the number of colors of mana spent to cast Radiant Flames. Now, you'll probably have some awkward instances where maybe you don't get the actual maximum value that you want out of it. Maybe you want to actually hit it for the X value to be 3, but you only have the configuration to have an X value of 2 with different colors that you're actually spending on the Radiant Flames. So sometimes it's going to work out really, really well for you just based on the way that you're using your dual lands and fetch lands and whatnot, and sometimes it might be a little bit more awkward, but overall I think that this card is going to see a fair amount of play, and it's going to provide to be just that fire spout-ish type card that sideboards are going to want. We also have a Processor Assault, so sorcery speed, 2 cost, 1 and 1 red, devoid, and as an additional cost to cast it, put a card from an opponent's exile into that player's graveyard, and it's going to deal 5 damage to target creature. So again, we have all of this stuff that is playing with your opponent's exile and returning stuff from their exile into their grave and then doing something else. So if you have a whole lot of ways to actually interact with exiling your opponent's stuff, or maybe they're exiling their own stuff as well, then you get to just kind of synergize with it and also have a way to roast their creature, so to say. But also this doesn't have the downside of not being able to hit flying creatures like roast does. So it doesn't have any bias to whether or not it has flying or not. But at the same time, again, it requires a little bit more interaction and a little bit more timing with how everything's actually going to happen and fall into place. It always seems like we save the best for last when we go over and review cards, and Zada Headron Grinder is pretty much right on par with that. It's a 3/3 for 4 legendary creature, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell that targets only Zada Headron Grinder, copy that spell for each other creature you control that the spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those creatures. So whether you're playing a Titan Strength or you're playing a Become Immense, your Zada is going to copy that and it's going to distribute it to all of the rest of your creatures that it could potentially target. So that just seems insanely sweet and insanely fun to actually be able to build something like a bunch of pump spells within a deck, play a bunch of like small goblins that you're able to produce throughout the turn. This is also a goblin, so it could play into Goblin Piledriver and whatnot. And then just be able to, for very little mana whatsoever, just pump everything and then just swing with a alpha attack. And now we've reached our final stretch of the Essentials list for Battle for Zendikar with our green cards. So first and foremost, Woodland Wanderer. So it's a 2/2 for 4 mana, which doesn't seem all that great, but it has Vigilance and Trample and also Converge, where it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each color of mana spent to cast it. So another card that is going to reward you for playing a variety of different colors, and just even if you're splashing for stuff, doing so with fetch lands and dual lands so that you get maximum value out of it, and you can try to just make a massive Woodland Wanderer that is going to have Vigilance and Trample and is just going to be a sizable beater for the 4 mana invested. We also have Green Warden of Marasa, so this is kind of like a double Eternal Witness, if you want to call it. So it's a 5/4 for 6 mana, and whenever it enters the battlefield, you can return a target card from your graveyard to your hand, and also whenever the card dies, you can exile it, and if you do, you can return another target card from your graveyard to your hand. So it allows you to have 2 separate instances where you get to take something back, like Eternal Witness, and at the same time, it exiles itself, so it might actually play into something that you're trying to set up, but ultimately being able to recycle stuff and get stuff back is always pretty sweet, and it doesn't seem far-fetched that you could just play some kind of a ramp deck, ramp into this guy and get back something else that you might have played, like a See the Unwritten, and then just kind of rinse and repeat and just try to overwhelm your opponent. We also have a reprint of Sylvan Scrying, which was totally something that just kind of caught me really, really off guard, but I'm totally glad to actually see this card. Now, it's not actually accelerating you, it's not actually going to put the land out onto the battlefield, but this was a really unusual reprint that I think is actually just so appropriate right now in allowing you to just find more fixing, especially whenever you're playing with Converge and you're trying to build around that type of a strategy. But for sorcery speed, we have a 2-cost card that allows us to search our library for a land card, reveal it, and then put it into your hand and shuffle your library. So there's no real bias. It's not like Farseek where it only lets you search for one thing or another, or other things like Rampant Growth. The Sylvan Scrying just borderline lets you find any land out of your deck, put it into your hand, and then you can assure yourself that you're hitting land drops or hitting the appropriate mana that you actually want to see. And the last card on our list here for the Essentials is Undergrowth Champion. So this card just seems so sweet, and this is one of the cards that I actually really want to build around for this set. So it's a 2/2 for 3 mana, and if damage would be dealt to it while it has a +1/+1 counter on it, prevent that damage and remove a +1/+1 counter from the Undergrowth Champion. With landfall, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on the Undergrowth Champion. So this seems like a card that I really want to build a creatures with +1/+1 counters deck, and just being able to manipulate things with hardened scales, multiply the counters that are actually being put on my creatures, and then just interact with a lot of different things that we've already previously had. So the Undergrowth Champion, don't be surprised if this card finds its way into some kind of mono green +1/+1 counters deck with hardened scales. Even if it's not the most competitive thing, it's definitely going to be something fun that I would definitely play at an FNM or something like that. And there you guys have it. That is my list of the essentials that you need for the release of Battle for Zendikar. And this is my list of things that I will be looking out for whenever I'm cracking packs and opening stuff and looking for things to actually play in competitive, and also things that I'll probably hold on to and see if they go up in price, which I feel like for the majority of these cards, a lot of them actually will. Thank you guys for joining me, and thank you for sitting through this lengthy video and overview of the set. If you guys enjoyed it, I would greatly appreciate it if you hit the thumbs up button on the video and subscribe to the channel for more Magic the Gathering content. You guys can leave any comments down in the comments below about Battle for Zendikar and what cards you're actually on the lookout for and things that you're hopeful to pull, whether it's the pre-release or actually the release of the set. But let me know down in the comments below what you guys think of Battle for Zendikar and what you're actually excited about, if anything. And until next time, guys, thank you for watching, and peace out.